Hi, Tommy Heffernan, veterinary consultant here with Precision Microbes. Welcome back for another Tech in 10, where I try and cover a technical subject in under 10 minutes. A lot of writing on the board today. I'm going to cover a subject today which has been really interesting for me as an observer, certainly over the last 12 months, while Ryan Duffy was with us looking at silage and silage quality. I'm back in that space again. I'm going to an event tomorrow on silage. So I want to cover, as not an expert, but what I've learned about silage making and silage quality, and the art of fermentation for silage and how important it is. So here we go, 10 minutes. So grass, we know, is a super feed for animals, and we think about silage, the second most important feed of the winter feed. 25% of dairy cow feed is silage. In some farms, cattle farms, it's 35% of feed. So quality really matters. Obviously, we have an additive. It's not just about additives. I think it's like when we talk about any Precision Microbes products, they're tools along with good management. So what I've learned about silage that I didn't know a lot about, well, obviously, cutting time is really important. When we cut the plant, it's pretty obvious that it's not heading out. This time of year, we're really cutting a quality product. And as soon as it's cut, the race is sort of on then from a fermentation point of view. When we look at wilting silage, getting dry matter percentages correct, people talk about 30%, getting that sweet spot, heading silage out is really important. And then we harvest it, where looking at dry matter and moisture in silage, choplint becomes important. And I've seen this practically as well on farm when I look at rumen health issues, and I covered even rumination before, and we look at choplint. But when it comes to sealing, getting the product into a pit or bale, that's where additives come in, or natural fermentation, if you like. But ultimately, we're trying to get rid of oxygen. We're creating an anaerobic environment. We're sealing that pit where fermentation can occur. And whether we're using additives or not, what we're looking to do is really important to understand that fermentation process. So Precision Microbes, we are fermentation experts. That's what we do with our different products and our different ranges, and we're even getting better at that. It's really exciting to look at the role of fermentation and what we can do with it around making different products bioavailable through fermentation. But anyway, let's get back to silage. So we look at grass, we look at the sugars in grass, we look at fermentation. Ultimately, it's a story about good and bad bacteria. And we're trying to get fermentation and the production of lactic acid. Ultimately, we're trying to drop the pH quickly. And if you look at the sugars in silage, you think about fructose and glucose. Good and bad bacteria will have different ways of operating. So if we look at the bacteria, the lactobacillus bacteria, they will use sugars as a food source to produce lactic acid. Now we have homofermentive and heterofermentive, we'll talk about that. But ultimately, if we get bad bacteria in there, now where do bad bacteria come from? Well, if we look at cutting, soil contamination, I was speaking to a friend yesterday who's recently applied slurry to silage ground and is worried about, the slurry microbes being in there. That's something that could occur. If we look at, well, what are the bad bugs doing? Clostridial species are an example of that. Well, they're using the sugars to produce acetic acid, butyric acid. We've all smelled that butyric acid smell from bad silage. CO2. They're turning proteins, into amines and ammonia, which aren't as useful. So when we look at silage analysis, we look at pH. One of the things we look at is ammonia and nitrogen levels, which can actually be a sign of poor degradation or preservation with protein. They create heat. So ultimately, the bad bacteria are creating a range of products from these sugars. So the sugars in grass that we want to ferment, if we've got the right bugs in there, will produce lactic acid, which is really effective at dropping the pH down to 3.8 to 4.2. But the bad bugs, they turn that sugar into unpalatable silage. We've all smelled that butyric, and the pH won't get down, heat, etc. So this is a challenge. So we've got, look, obviously, when we think about additives as well, like you won't turn moist, poorly cut silage, where bad quality silage into good silage with additives. But certainly you have a lot more control when we look at additives. But what we ultimately want to think about is what controls the fermentation, the bad bugs or the good bugs. And that's where additives come in, is that you're controlling the production of lactic acid, the fermentation, and ultimately, again, negative impact, soil, slurry, moisture, even poor sealing at the pit, it bales. So we get really good feedback. If you go to Precision Microbes, precisionsilage.ie, I'll link it in down here, you'll see some of the feedback from farmers who are using it, particularly around bales. I get lots of videos from farmers who I know who've been using Precision Microbe silage additive when they're opening bales and they can't get over, the quality with bales. So ultimately, when we're controlling fermentation, good or bad bacteria, now we use homofermentive bacteria. They're twice as effective at producing lactic acid from sugars and fructose and glucose. So when we look at additives, we're trying to use this whole fermentation process. Now, there's always an argument that if you've got the right quality crop caught, wilted, and clamped correctly, do you need additives? I suppose additives give you a little bit more control. So Precision Microbes, what is Precision Microbes doing in the silage space? We're microbial fermentation experts. Well, it's a live liquid ready to use. So in our 10-litre drums, you can use it at ultra low dosing straight on at 100 mils per ton. So there's two ways of applying it: ultra low dosing or standard dosing. Ultra low dosing is ready to use straight on. And what you're doing with ultra low dosing, you probably can't see it, you're micro misting out the live microbes across silage. And what that's going to do then is propagate. Those bacteria are going to produce, utilize those sugars we talked about to produce lactic acid and reduce the pH. Again, with standard dosing, you're putting in 10%, so it's a litre per ton, but it's 10% solution. So 100 mils of microbes with 900 mils of clean water. That's a more liquid, high voluminous dose at a litre per ton, but it's ultimately the same rate of product. If I had a preference for the results, and this is only my opinion from talking to lots of farmers who use our product, is ultra low dosing. Now that depends on your contractor having that available, but I think ultra low dosing makes sense from a micro misting from the results we're seeing as well. What are we seeing? We're seeing preservation. So you won't make bad silage good, but what you will do is you get excellent preservation. So the nutrient values of dry matter, feed value, protein in the silage, you're going to get less losses. So preservation of feed quality, less waste. So you're going to get less waste within the pit. We see that within bales as well. Feed out. And this is something that's really interesting because we're using a homofermentive product. I obviously have a big interest in cow health and rumen health. I've covered rumen recently on Tech and 10, is that you get really good feed out. So obviously when you have bad bugs and you have butyric acid and higher pH and heating and all that, you have issues with feed out. But I think even from a rumen health point of view, using homofermentive inoculants helps. And again, I've made a note here on bales, really works well on bales. So microbes, we're fermentation experts. It's really the farm biome approach. When you look at the application of microbes, you can look at slurry, silage. These are all areas we've looked at, obviously with calves and the gut as well. I'm incredibly biased, but our additive gets really good feedback. We're looking at silage quality making. I think it is really interesting when you look at the whole fermentation process and why you want good bacteria over bad bacteria. It's such a valuable resource on the farm, silage quality, getting the basics of management correct. Now, if you go to Precision Microbes on our YouTube channels, on all our kind of social media, we have a lot of educational videos on the why behind silage, but that's my kind of synopsis of what I've learned about silage making in this Tech and 10 this week. That's it. See you next week.